Will you tell me about your parents and what they did during the war and how they got to Israel?
So first of all, both of them were born in a little town in eastern Poland, not far from the border with Russia, near the Bug River. My father served in the Polish army, and he was captured by the Germans, was put into a war prisoners camp, and then released, and then recaptured the second time, and then re-released the second time. His family left to the zone occupied by the Soviet Union, and at a certain point they were thinking about going back to their town, which in the meantime has been occupied by the Germans. Fortunately enough, in retrospect, they were captured by the Russians, and they were sent to a labor camp in Archangel, and later they were moved to other labor camps deep in Siberia, like many other Jews, like many other Polish Jews, because they were considered to be sort of counter-revolutionary elements.
Mm-hmm.
The Polish Jews who refused to renounce their Polish citizenship were put into labor camps. Towards the end of the war, my father was mobilized again into a Polish unit in the Red Army. And according to my mother's story, he was among the liberators of Berlin. He served for a while in the Polish army after the war, and then he was convinced or persuaded by some Jewish people that he met to actually leave Poland and go to a DP camp in Germany, to Fehrenwald, which was the largest DP camp in occupied Germany. As for my mother, her family, she came from a Jewish Orthodox background, and her family decided to stay in Poland. I mean, I don't know if they decided or they were too old or too scared. Actually, her father was a little bit concerned about escaping to the Soviet Union, because he had very troubling memories from the First World War, because many Jews and Poles who escaped to Russia during First World War have never come back, so he was a little bit concerned about it. My mother was the only person of her family, she was a young woman at the time, who decided to escape. Actually, her father didn't approve it, but her older sister approved it, and she was the only survivor of her family. Eventually, her family were taken first to the local ghetto that was established in her hometown, which is called Sokolov Podlaski, and they were deported to Treblinka, which is not far from this little town, and all her family perished there. So she was the only survivor. She spent some time in the she spent most of the wartime in the Soviet Union, in many prisons and camps. But eventually, after the agreement between the Polish government and the Polish government in exile and the Soviet Union, after the German invasion, she was given some kind of like the other Jews, she was released from prison, from the camp, and she was sort of free to go to other regions of the Soviet Union. She chose to go to Bukhara in Uzbekistan because she had some not really family members, but some very close friends and hosting family that was also from her hometown, Sokolov. So she spent she spent her time until the end of the war in Uzbekistan, in Bukhara, and when the war ended, she decided to go to Poland to look for her family. And actually, at that time, she wasn't aware of the fate of most of the Polish Jews. She wasn't. She heard some rumors and some news about atrocities that were committed against the Jews in Poland, but she wasn't aware of the full scale of the horror and the destruction. I mean, there were not any Jews in this town anymore. Very few of them survived, and.
Did she meet?
She met a Polish, I think that he was a judge or a member of the local intelligentsia, and he actually warned her and told her to leave the place because there were some pogroms taking place in nearby towns against Jews, pogroms that were perpetrated by local Poles. She decided to leave Poland, and she also heard while she was visiting her hometown, she heard that one of her teachers, one of her most favorite teachers in Sokolov, in her town, managed to survive the war. She came back to Sokolov and was actually murdered by Poles. So after
a Jewish teacher.
Yeah, a Jewish woman. And after that, after she heard this story and other horror stories, she decided that she would never set a foot in Poland. For her, as for many other Jews, and later this notion was sort of adopted by the Israeli state. For her, Poland has become the graveyard of the Jewish people, and she swore that she would never set a foot there again.
And how did she get to Vienna?
Okay, so one of her iconic stories about her experience in Vienna is that when they were marching in Vienna, a large group of young Polish Jewish women refugees, they looked obviously like our stereotypical image of miserable refugees. They were dirty, unwashed, wearing rags. And she remembered all these ladies, Viennese ladies, going to the opera with their elegant dresses and their fur coats, and they all looked down at these dirty young women. And this experience of feeling so humiliated by this gaze of these elegant, sophisticated Viennese ladies was really a very powerful memory for my mother, and it has become one of her iconic stories.
Being born in Israel in the 50s, What was Europe for you? What did it mean actually?
Well, Europe, obviously, it's, at least now, I'm aware of the fact that it's a very diverse and heterogeneous place. But at that time, for me at least, Europe was a sort of a fantasy. If I talk about my childhood, it was a place where enlightenment and civilization prevails, whereas the place that I grew up, this was my view at that time, even though I was still politically unaware of all the complexities and the difficulties of living there, but I've always felt that I lived in a sort of very marginal, difficult, provincial, parochial place. So for me, Europe symbolized some kind of fantasy place, a place where one can lead sort of normal life and be very affluent and educated, etc.
But actually, this is where your parents have suffered so badly.
Yeah, but I think that you need to distinguish, this is what I want to clarify, you need to distinguish between Poland and Europe. And again, at least at that time in the early 50s, as a child, I was already aware of the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So Western Europe was represented as a sort of a place of fantasy, whereas Eastern Europe has always been looked at as, the way the Nazis perceived it, as a sort of a semi-Asiatic place, as sort of barbaric, uncivilized place.
It's very ironic because after all, people suffered in all of those countries in the West and in the East.
Yeah.
And the Germans were definitely not Eastern. The Nazis, they were not Eastern, they were Western. And they thought themselves to be Western. And yet you seem to internalize the bias against the East.
Yeah, that's very true. There were all kinds of contradictions that were epitomized by, the kind of perceptions and ideas and fantasies that we had about Europe. But even in Israel, there was a hierarchy between German Jews and Polish Jews, and even though politically speaking, Polish Jews were ruling the country, German Jews were considered to be more educated, more liberal, more European than the Eastern European Jews. And this was also the self-perception of the German Jews themselves. In a way, they looked down on Polish Jews and later on Russian Jews. So there was a sort of an internalization of, I hesitate to say, of Nazi ideas, but there was a sort of an internalization of racial ideas about both Jews and Europeans.
So Zionism, in a sense, educated you to deny and, in a sense, reject East and also the Asiatic background.
Yeah, there are all kinds of paradoxes that are involved in Zionist ideology, because on one hand, the utopian vision of Zionism is to go back to the Orient. At the same time, this vision, this project, was materialized through the help of the so-called West, through the support of the British Empire. But at the same time, there was a sort of denial and even hostility towards the Orient, even though I think that the attitude towards the Orient as a concept and also as a geographical place has always been ambivalent, both in the both in the conceptual articulation of Zionism, but also in the experience of political Zionism, in the experience of the settlement, of the colonial settlement of Palestine. So on one hand, the Arab or the Orient was conceived as even noble, as an object of admiration. In the beginning, in the early stages of the colonial settlement of Zionism, the settlers, the Jewish settlers, especially what is called the Shomer, which was the first military organization that was established in Palestine, they imitated the Arab paraphernalia. They used kafia, this oriental attire, and they rode horses. So there was a sort of an envy of the native Palestinian Arab and a desire to imitate him as a way to claim indigeneity, to claim that actually these settlers who came from Europe are the original natives of this ancient land.
It's really strange. We speak to each other Hebrew every day. We live in Hebrew, though we live in the in the UK.
In London.
we live in Hebrew most of the time when we are together, and now we're speaking in English. Is this less natural?
Yeah, obviously, but I think that this, in a way, exemplifies or epitomizes the sort of both inner and external exile that we live, and there is a sense of even alienation, or a sense that we live in some kind of bubble in our very little diasporic community, because I'm using the notion of community ironically, obviously, because we are not really community, and we are not even part of what I would call a diasporic community, because there are very few Israelis who live in London. The Israelis that we know are mostly, well, I would say all of them are members of anti-Zionist or dissident groups. They are all very critical of Israel and the Zionist project.
So it seems that you are also partly exiled from the language.
Yeah, I'm exiled from the language, but as you well know, I even have problems with the Hebrew language, even though it's my first language and I feel very comfortable talking Hebrew. Since I moved to London, I don't even read Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew literature, for example, very, very rarely. I've developed also sort of alienation from my own native first language, my mother language. I mean, it's not really my mother language, speaking literally, because my mother first language was Yiddish. Obviously, it wasn't Hebrew. but we speak Hebrew to each other because it seems more natural to us. And part of my problematic relationship with Hebrew derives from the fact that Hebrew, the revival of Hebrew for so-called secular reasons, was part of the Zionist project of building a nation. Because in order to have a nation, you need also, according to the classical definition of what is a nation, what is a nation state, you need your own language. And this is something that, as somebody who doesn't subscribe to the idea of the nation state, as somebody who doesn't believe in the idea of, especially the idea of an ethnic or nation state or religious nation state, I find the elevation of Hebrew into a sort of national language very, very problematic and very unsettling.
But it's the language you grew up in. It's
yeah,
the language you read.
Well, it's the language that I grew up with, but at the same time, my parents spoke Yiddish. Their Hebrew wasn't that good. So the languages that I heard at home were Polish and Yiddish, and some Hebrew. So I was actually the first one who really mastered the language. So I think that...
Did they speak to you in either Polish or Yiddish?
I think that when I was a baby, my mother still didn't know how to speak Hebrew, but she sort of forced herself to speak Hebrew because she didn't want... this was part of her desire to assimilate, to integrate into so-called Israeli society. And so I communicated with them in Hebrew because also I didn't know how to speak Yiddish, even though this was the language that I grew up with, hearing Yiddish. But I was ashamed of this language because...
Why?
Because the Yiddish language was associated with the whole notion of the diaspora, and that the diaspora as a political entity was rejected, is still rejected by Zionism, by the Israeli state. The core of the Zionist thinking is that all Jews should live in Israel, what they call Israel, what we call Palestine, and this is the natural homeland of the Jewish people, and Jews cannot live among non-Jews, and therefore the only place where Jewish life can exist is in the land, what they call the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And Yiddish was and still associated with this despised diaspora and with the despised figure of the diasporic Jew. So I was really ashamed of my parents speaking Yiddish. I still remember that I used to silence them when they spoke Yiddish in public. For example, when we were on a bus and they would speak Yiddish, I would silence them. And at that time, my mother used to call me an anti-Semite. She said, "You are like an anti-Semite. You don't allow me to speak Yiddish, the Jewish language." At the same time, she wasn't aware that I was the product of the Zionist project, the Zionist dream. I was the mythical Sabra who refused to speak any language for that matter, and was very proud of speaking Hebrew. So in a way, I was a success story of the Zionist project. But at the same time, I was raised up in a way that embodies all these contradictions and conflations that still exist between the thinking behind Zionism and the thinking behind traditional, what I would call classical anti-Semitism.
But not only you were a success story, but it seems that your mother also was a success story as a Zionist.
She wasn't really a success story. I wouldn't call her a success story. I mean, she
was a convert.
She was a voluntary, willing convert to Zionism, and she had no doubts about the philosophy and the thinking behind the Zionist project. But at the same time, her Hebrew was an accented Hebrew. Her Hebrew wasn't perfect. She didn't look or sound or acted in what we would call an Israeli manner. So, I mean, everybody could see that she wasn't from here or from there. She was still a diasporic Jew. She was a Polish Jew.
So I wonder how this affects your identity today. You live outside of Israel. You speak Hebrew mainly to me, and
or maybe only
you don't read Hebrew hardly ever. Are you British, European? Are you living in a diaspora? Who are you? Yes, who are you?
Who am I? Good question. But again, it's a matter for a very long discussion. But first of all, I don't subscribe to any school of identity politics. So I think, in this respect, I subscribe to the ideas that were propagated by people like Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, etc. And I think about identity as something that is in flux. It is not something that is fixed. It is intersectional, as they like to talk about it in contemporary, trendy sociological terms. So my own identity is also in flux. At the same time, I'm fully aware of the fact that I'm not the only arbiter of my identity, because my identity is also imposed on me by others. Living here in London, people many times ask me, where are you from? And when I say I'm from London, and then they say, where are you really from? And I say, I'm from Crouch End, which is a neighborhood, a sort of trendy area in London. But they say, but you have an accent. And sometimes I refuse to say where I'm from, and sometimes because I just don't want to get into too many explanations and exploration of all these complex issues related to my identity and to my sort of voluntary exile in London. So it means that people don't perceive me as an natural English woman, even though I can pass as an English woman due to my fair complexion, my blue eyes, etc. So, but if you're black or if you're brown, you cannot hide your identity unless you wear a burqa, and then you don't hide your identity either. So other people have all kinds of assumptions about your identity. So I'm completely aware of the fact that very few people are privileged enough to be in control over their identity. Maybe I'm even one of these privileged people, except when I open my mouth and start speaking English in my heavily accented English, making some mistakes from time to time. But how do I see myself? I see myself as belonging to nowhere. In an ideal world, which I still dream about, there won't be any nation state, there won't be any borders, there won't be any boundaries. So, in an ideal world, I will define myself as a human being, as a creature actually, because I'm also very conscious about the existence of animals and other living creatures on this planet.
We are now part of the EU, but shortly we will not be part of the EU. Or maybe Brexit won't happen, but if it does, then do we stop being Europeans? You lived as a child a dream of coming to Europe. Now you came to Europe, and now Europe is going away from you. So how do you feel about all this?
Yeah, I mean, there are many dimensions to it. I mean, it's a very complex question again, and the answer is going to be even more complex. So first of all, I would say that I don't like to sound too Eurocentric, but I really lament the fact that we are separating from Europe. The night after the referendum, when we woke up and heard the bad news, I felt like many other friends and colleagues of mine, they all described the same. It's really interesting because they all share the same feeling. They felt like a member of their family died. And there was a feeling of mourning, as if you have lost a very close friend or a family member. And it was quite horrible. At the same time, again, I don't want to sound too Eurocentric, because Europe, I mean, even the idea, the concept of Europe, like the whole concept of identity, is a constructed concept, and we should ask, where is Europe? Where are the boundaries of Europe? Who are members of the so-called European club, etc. So, despite being very critical about the whole notion of Europe and the exclusivity, because any kind of definition, especially political, socio-cultural, political definition, is based on exclusion. So, despite being very critical of the whole idea of Europe as a political concept, I still feel very, I mean, I would use even a very strong language and say that I've been really almost traumatized by the decision to separate from Europe. And one of the reasons is because one of my fantasies of escaping from Israel, apart from the sheer political dimension that was associated with my decision to leave Israel, was the experience of living under siege, or better still, living in a sort of militarized Jewish ghetto. And I was dreaming about freedom, the freedom to move, the freedom not to be confined by borders and boundaries and checkpoints, etc. And this was still a dream of a privileged Jewish, white Jewish Ashkenazi Israeli woman. And Europe, to a certain extent, manifested this sort of limited fantasy to live without borders. And finally, I arrived to what I perceived to be Europe. And then this sort of semi-dream was taken away from me again. So the idea of, again, being subject to borders, to different passports, etc., is so alienating, so hateful to me. It's really painful.
So you ran away from borders, and now they've come after you.
Yeah, it's
followed you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like running away from one ghetto, from a Jewish militarized ghetto, and finding myself in another ghetto, another isolationist ghetto that is becoming more and more xenophobic, Islamophobic, anti-European, and it's really scary. It makes me feel very uncomfortable.
So actually living in London until now, with so many Europeans around us, in a sense what you seem to be saying is that you felt at home because it was a mixture of many countries, and now you will have to live with the English alone. Of course not, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I should emphasize that, I mean, all kinds. London is considered to be the most cosmopolitan city in the world. It is even more cosmopolitan than places like New York and Los Angeles. And you are surrounded by people from all over the globe, so it's like the whole world in one city. It's a global city, it's a world city. And this is exactly what I like about London, about the diversity, especially the human diversity. So it's not only living surrounded by Europeans. I mean, I have some European friends, but it's just being exposed to this enormous human and cultural and political diversity, and this is what I find most attractive about living here. Whereas the Brexit project is based on the negation of this experience and some kind of imperialist fantasy about nostalgia, about going back to the glorious days of the British Empire, which obviously I detest. But I should also mention that from my personal point of view, which is not only personal, it's also part of my political belief, for me to be at home is not to feel at home. I used a very interesting quote from Theodor Adorno as a motto for the conclusion of my book, Identity Politics on the Israeli Screen. And this is the quotation, the citation. "It is part of morality not to be at home in one's home." And I think that this is, in a way, my sort of, I would say, even credo, or the core of my existence in a way. I never feel at home anywhere. And once I become a little bit integrated, I also become very critical and of the place. I become very interested in the history of the place, and I become aware of all the moral complexities and issues that are involved in living in a special place. I lived actually in 3 countries. I lived in Israel, I lived in the States, in the United States, and now I'm living in the UK, even though I tend to think about myself as living in London, which I see as some kind of entity that is removed from the rest of the UK. So I think that one should never be blind to the history and the political forces that produced the place. So, Chaim, can you tell me a little bit about your background and especially about your family history? Particularly what happened to your parents during World War II?
My parents lived in southern Poland. They are first cousins, and they lived in a small town which was basically a steel town, an industrial town, where the Jews were the majority, and they were organized steel workers in the main. A lot of them were communists, but my parents were Bundists. They were not communists, they were not Zionists, where the rest of the family was divided between those two. They were Bundists. So some of the family went to Palestine in the 30s, and others became communists and supported the Soviet Union. My parents were Polish, and they were Polish Jews, and that was their identity. Of course, in the war they were put into the local ghetto. It was the worst place, they said, that they ever spent time in. They thought it was worse than Auschwitz, because in Auschwitz they didn't expect anything from the Germans, but of course in the ghetto there was a Jewish police, and from them they expected some humanity which they didn't get. So that was a very difficult experience for them. All their family was destroyed by 1943. They were taken away, one roll call after another, and most of them died in Treblinka, like your family. My parents were taken in summer 1944 on the train to a very short ride to Auschwitz. Actually, in a car it would be 15 minutes. It took them 3 days in the train. Many people died in the carriages, and they arrived in June 1944. And Auschwitz was not a holiday camp, obviously. They both worked. They only met once in Auschwitz. My father already lost his wife, who died in 1942, and my mother was his cousin, and they met in Auschwitz across an electrified fence, and he threw her a loaf of bread, or half a loaf of bread that he just got, and that's all that he could give her. And they remembered this throughout. Of course, they knew each other very well. My mother was very much in love with him. And in 1945, they survived the summer and the very difficult winter of 1945. And in January, the Russians were across the Bug, and they were preparing to enter Auschwitz, and the Nazis took the whole population. The women were marched to Germany on a death march, and most of them died. My mother made it alive, but very, very weak, to Bergen-Belsen. It was even worse than Auschwitz, because by that time the whole order fell apart. The camp was not organized. There was hardly any food. There were many diseases that people died. They didn't die because of an extermination process. They died because there was nothing to keep them alive. She got typhoid, and when she was liberated with very few people by the British in April, she spent 2 months in the hospital until she was cured of the typhoid. She was treated very well, and she was very grateful to the British for the treatment that she got. When she was liberated, she was 34 kilos in weight. She very much wanted, once she was healthy enough, to find my father. Because she looked in the Red Cross books that listed all the survivors, and she found his name as a survivor in Austria. Indeed, the men, 6,000 men that survived in Auschwitz until the end, he was one of them, were taken on a death march to Austria, and they ended up in Mauthausen. And my father was unfortunate enough to be allocated to a subcamp called Gusen II, which was a terrible place, where he and few hundred others were basically slaves that worked as human mules, carrying carriages in the mountain tunnels where the V2 was produced. So they didn't have even rags to wear. They were totally naked in that winter. They were tying themselves to the carriages by leather tongues that attached them to the carriage, and this is how they carried the carriages back and forth in the tunnels. When the Americans arrived on the 8th of May, these people were walking skeletons. We have a picture of my father on the Liberation Day that an American photographer with the Army Communication Corps took. And in one picture, my father and two of his colleagues are actually cooking some food that the Americans gave them. They are all skeletons. He was 32 kilos, even less than my mother, on the Liberation Day. But they were amazing survivors. The fact that they survived this terrible ordeal made them positive about a number of things. It made them positive about life, about the need to take this to another generation, and to find each other. My father ended up walking all the way to Torino in Italy because he didn't want to go back to Poland, where he suffered so much. And he thought he might be able to get to America, but of course that wasn't on the cards at all. And he then joined a kibbutz in Torino that was preparing people to go to Israel. My mother found him after 3 months of crossing Europe on foot. I have no idea how she did it. She found him in Torino. They married a week later, in October of 1945. They moved to Rome to be near a camp, a very lovely camp that was actually opened in the villa of Mussolini's lover in the mountains above Rome, in a place called Rocca di Papa, where the Pope has his summer palace. So it's a very auspicious holiday place, and they lived there very happily. They were very well treated by the Italian population, who liked them, who helped them, and they also helped the Italians because they had more food than the Italians. They were getting food parcels from the Red Cross, and the Italians weren't. And I was born in 1946 in Rome, and ended up on the boat to Israel that was just born in June of 1948, so I was 18 months or so. We ended up in Israel. Immediately after the war started, my father refused military training on the boat. He didn't think that after what they have been through, he should kill or get killed. He didn't want to have anything to do with violence ever in his life. And the Israelis didn't quite appreciate this and put him in jail. And he was in jail for 6 weeks until they broke him, and he agreed to be a medic, unarmed medic, and he partook in some of the bloodiest battles, especially one in Latrun, where 2,000 Holocaust survivors who were drafted like him died in a few days. Most of them, nobody knew their names. They were just chucked into big holes and were buried, a group burial, because nobody knew who they were. They came from the boat and fought and died maybe less than a week until they arrived. He survived, and we ended up living in part of Jaffa after that.
And can you tell me a little bit about Jaffa, of your childhood, and explain also what is Jaffa?
Well, of course, Jaffa was the largest city in Palestine at the time. It was a port city. Jaffa was taken in April of 1948 by a very brutal attack of the right-wing Irgun. And most of the people of Jaffa went on boats, those that survived this, and ended up in Gaza as refugees. Actually, we ended up living not in Jaffa proper, but in a little town south of Jaffa called Jabaliya. And actually, the people from Jabaliya have ended up living in a camp that they call Jabalia in Gaza, commemorating their town. The town itself was lovely. It was a modern town built in the 20s to accommodate rich people from the mountain villages and towns of Palestine, where they would come and spend the winter and sometimes even the summer by the sea. So this town had almost no Palestinians left in it. Some were left, but most of them were expelled forcibly. And everyone living there was a survivor of the Holocaust. So this was not a proper part of Israel. Most of the grown-ups did not speak Hebrew. My parents spoke Hebrew, but very broken Hebrew at the beginning. Yiddish was their language, as was everybody else was speaking Yiddish in Jabaliya. That was the language of the survivors. This was not a language that Israel at the time welcomed. There were special taxes on papers printed in Yiddish, on books printed in Yiddish. It was illegal to produce theater in Yiddish, and there was no radio in Yiddish. They felt that they have lost not just the war in Europe, but also in Palestine, because they thought they come to a Jewish society, but this Jewish society was almost anti-Semitic, because it actually was hostile towards people who spoke and lived in Yiddish, like my parents and yours. The willing agents of this were the children, like myself. Children like me were taught in school to tell their parents, don't speak Yiddish, speak Hebrew. And we didn't know any better, so when we were on the bus, when we were in public and my parents spoke Yiddish, I said to them, don't speak Yiddish, speak Hebrew. I didn't understand that what I'm doing is really terrible. All the children did that, you did that, I did that, all the people we know like us did that. So we were the willing but unwitting agents of Zionism, of instigating Hebrew as the only language allowed for Jews in Israel, and basically castigating Yiddish into a non-language of a non-people, of the people who died, and with them Zionism wanted this language to die. The culture that existed for hundreds of years also died with them. So on the one hand, Zionism wanted continuity of Jewish life, but not continuity with the diaspora. The continuity they were looking for is with Joshua and Moses and, you know, biblical figures, rather than with live Jews like us. We didn't belong in this narrative, and therefore we had to lose the culture, lose the language, lose the memories, and become Israelized into new Jews, Jews that use arms, go to the army, unlike my father that refused to fight, that they actually fight willingly and very committed to military life. So this was a very difficult time for my parents. As a child, I did not understand this. And I also didn't understand when I was 20 or so, that changing my name to a Hebrew name, changing my surname to a Hebrew name, in other words, giving up my real surname, my parents' surname, and choosing a Hebraized word like Bresheeth, is the worst thing I could do to them. So not only did they lose their language, did they lose their memories in life, but their own son has chosen, in order to be more Israeli, to shed even the name that the parents gave him, which was all that they could give him. So this was, I know a lot of people did that. You didn't do that. Which I'm proud of.
Well, I mean, I also wanted to change my name. I was always ashamed of my diasporic family name.
But you did not change it.
I didn't change it.
Why?
I'm not sure even why. I'm not sure.
Well, probably you didn't find it so easy to reject your parents. I don't know, but I didn't feel I'm rejecting my parents, because though I was 20, I was not really intelligent in the way that Israelis are not intelligent about identity. They assume the identity that they are given, and they don't question the whole act of identity formation from the ground up. And I didn't question it. I really, because I lived in Jabalia, that wasn't part of Israel proper, where people spoke Yiddish. It doesn't matter what we children said, they continued to live in Yiddish. They loved the language, It's a very funny language. I like it now, but I didn't then. Then I was ashamed that my parents spoke Yiddish, that they told very funny jokes in Yiddish, that they wanted to go to plays that were not legal to enjoy Yiddish. One of my memories is going to see a Yiddish version of Hamlet, and the police raiding the theater halfway through the play. And for a lot of years I didn't know how Hamlet ends, because I didn't see the end of it.
It doesn't end well.
Well, but I wanted to know how it ends. And of course I understood Yiddish, and I even spoke it because it was my first language. My parents spoke Yiddish in Italy, and I spoke to them in Yiddish. Having come as a little child to Israel, I spoke very little, but what I spoke was a mixture of Italian and Yiddish. I now had to learn a foreign language, which was very alien to me, Hebrew. And then I had to learn that this was not a foreign language, that this was my only language, and that all the other languages I spoke, which later on also included Polish, because some people from the family came from Poland and lived with us, that all these other languages I knew, Yiddish, Italian and Polish, were foreign, were not acceptable, that one shouldn't speak them, and I accepted it. I accepted this without too much opposition.
Chaim, your family, when you lived in Jaffa, in Jabalia, you lived in an Arab-Palestinian house. And my understanding is that all the Jews who lived there lived in Arab houses of people who were evicted, forcibly evicted and expelled from Arab Palestinian Jaffa.
Yes, unfortunately that's true. So, you know, they took all these refugees that had nowhere to live and put them in the houses of Palestinian refugees. And this was done by design, so that it will be impossible to return those who have run away in 1948 and been expelled by the army back to their homes. So they used the survivors as a political tool to dispossess the Palestinians. My mother always told us that this is not our home. It wasn't clear if we have a home, because when we asked where is our home, she said, you haven't got a home because I had a home in Poland and it doesn't exist anymore. So, but she said, this is not our place. There are other people that live here, and all the stuff around that they left was kept by her in a special place by the kitchen, so that on the day that they would come, and she believed that they would come back, and that we need to leave, and she explained this to us. They would be able to get their stuff back. So she kept everything that she found in their home. And so we knew that we are not at home. We didn't feel at home. And yet, as children, this is the only home we had, and we loved it. We loved it because it was by the sea, in a very beautiful place, peaceful place. And it was very strange that our home is not our home. But she, my mother really cared about the fact that we are living in somebody else's home, because she lost her own home. In 1956, during or immediately after the war, the Suez War, the owners of this flat came all the way from Gaza, from the refugee camp, to see their home. I was standing one day and looking down from the balcony, and I saw two women and two children pointing at me and talking in Arabic just underneath. And I don't know how I knew that, but I knew that they belonged to this place and the place belonged to them. I was 10 years old, so I was not a baby. And I ran to my mother and said, "Mom, they have come." And what is more amazing is that she knew who I meant. She knew that I meant the people whose home this is, because their narrative was so part of our life. So she went down and spoke with them and brought them up, and they all sat and talked, and they talked in Italian because before the war the women spent a few years in in Libya because of the husband of the woman who came was an engineer, and he got a job in Libya before the war, and they all spoke Italian because Italian was spoken in Libya. So they had a language together. They shared a language that they could communicate in. And what is more interesting, I still remembered some of my Italian that I spoke as a child, and I could understand most of what they were saying. So I was sitting on the floor with a little boy and a little girl that came with them, and kind of mock playing with them. I didn't have any language with them. They were speaking Arabic and I spoke Hebrew, and we didn't have a language in common, but we tried to play together. But I was more interested in what the grown-ups were saying. And they were talking about the war, and my mother said, "Of course, I kept everything that you left in the house. I kept it, and it's yours, and you can take anything that you want." And they were very surprised. They were pleased that she kept it, but they were very nervous. Until that point, they were all very friendly and pally with each other and so on. But then my mother suggested to show them all the things that she kept and they can take. And she took them to this place by the kitchen, and the two women started crying terribly. And the children and I didn't understand why they're crying. And the children started crying as well, because they saw their mother and their aunt crying. It was very difficult because they knew why they're crying. My mother knew why they're crying, but I didn't know what's going on, and the children didn't know what's going on. They were younger than me. And my mother said, "Take anything that you want. And then when you come back, we will leave." And the woman looked at her and said, "We will never come back. Don't you understand this, lady? We will never come back. We don't believe in this anymore." And my mother said, "No, you will come back." And I think the woman said to my mother, "Are you going back to Poland?" And my mother said, "No." And then they took two paraffin lights, old paraffin lights, lamps, which is all they could carry, as a memento, and left and said that they will come with their husbands who also want to see this place. And they went back to Gaza. We never saw them again because the month after, Israel was ejected from the Sinai and from Gaza, and they could never cross again. And so we never seen them again in that house, in that flat.
I'll make a sort of conceptual and emotional leap and ask you, how did you end up in Britain? And which then I understand was part of Europe.
I think I said that the first thing that my mother gave us, without meaning probably, is the idea and the knowledge that we are not at home. That this is not our home, that this is the home of other people. So when I was in university, I wanted to study abroad. I spent years trying to be Israeli. I changed my name, I changed my thinking, but I obviously failed in this transformation effort. And so I wanted to go to this Europe that my parents have run away from and to find out about it. I came to Britain to study, and my life changed immediately. I very much liked the... it was a very different world. It was a totally different world from the frenetic, overheated, nervous realities of Israel. And I very much appreciated that. So I found Britain and Europe to be much more relaxed than Israel. Obviously, I wasn't part of an occupying power for the first time in a long time. But it took me some time to understand all this, because after a while I found myself with a group of anti-Zionists from Matzpen, which is a radical organization, very small radical organization in Israel. And I joined this group and started studying about the history of Zionism and the very difficult facts, which in some sense I always knew, because my mother, in a sense, introduced me to the occupation and to colonialism by saying, this is not your home, this is not your house. She was not political, but emotionally she understood this because she was a refugee. So then I had to read and study and understand the depths of deprivation the Palestinians went through because of Zionism. Now, I never wanted to be a Zionist, and I wanted to be Israeli, but I didn't understand that to be an Israeli meant to be a Zionist in those years. Yeah, there was no other choice, apparently. Of course, this was not true, but I didn't know about other choices. And when I came to London, I understood through Matzpen that you don't need to be a Zionist. Indeed, you can, understanding Zionism, oppose it or actively oppose it. And so gradually but very quickly I have been transformed into an opponent of Zionism. And for me, London did that, and I don't think it would have happened in Israel, at least not very quickly and not at the same time. So that was an additional benefit of living in London, living, if you wish, in the diaspora, so hated by Zionism, and living in Europe, where a lot of people living together is the norm, or was the norm, until most of the British, a very small majority of them, decided that we should leave the EU, which I never accepted and I still do not accept, and I hope that we will never leave the EU, not because I think the EU is the best thing that ever happened, but I think that to be part of Europe is much preferable than to be incarcerated in a nationalist and racist island that Britain may well become, is on a way to becoming. So, in a sense, I came to Europe and it liberated me, and now English nationalists and racists want to take this Europe away from all of us. And Europe is an idea, it's not a place. You know, the countries might be more of a place, but Europe is an idea. It's an idea of a lot of different people living together. It's not like the United States, where everyone speaks the same language, and not only speaks the same language, but thinks, most of them think the same awful simplicities nowadays. So Europe is not like that. It has many cultures, many languages, many people, and that is part of its great strength. And that, to lose that, to be in a monoculture, a monolinguistic monoculture, even worse, in Brexit England is hateful and inconceivable to me. And I hope it never happens.
I hope so too. Inshallah.
I agree. We're finished. Okay.